So welcome everybody to this Women in Identity webinar. My name is Emma Lindley. I'm co-founder of Women in Identity. And in Identity, we talk about lots of different use cases, use cases for financial services, use cases for healthcare, use cases for government. The use case that we're going to talk today, I think there really has never been a more important use case to talk about. And 20th of June was World Refugee Day. So the use case we're going to talk today is around refugees. And just some of the statistics for you from the UNHCR. Over the last 10 years, refugees in globally displaced people have increased from 12 million 10 years ago to 27 million to today. And interestingly, the countries that those refugees come from, we'll all be familiar with what's happening in Ukraine. Many of us probably think that that's the majority of the refugees that are displaced today. But actually, the statistics from the UNHCR say that 69% of refugees come from 5 countries. Those countries are Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan and Myanmar, and 31% come from lots of other countries. So we've got 3 people with us today who are going to talk to those use cases, both from a grassroots level, understanding of what's actually happening on the ground, and then what can be helpful in terms of developing identity products for those people. What are some of the challenges? And then what happens when we get it right? What are the things that we can actually enable those people to do and empower them to do? So I'm going to hand over to my guests today. Giselle, Nina and Louise, welcome. I'm going to ask you in that order if you can just introduce yourselves, give a bit about your background, and then I've got a whole bunch of questions that I want to ask you today. Giselle.
Oh. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Emma, for having me. And I am very excited to be part of this panel and to discuss this topic. So I'm Giselle Frederick. My background is within tech, predominantly within finance. My day job is as a program associate at a Web3 VC in London. So we help accelerate startups that the VC has invested in, getting them to market, getting them launch ready and getting them ready for investments. I come from the world of finance, and I've done many projects, some of which were on identity solutions for big corporates. And I guess the capacity that I'm here is because of the work that I'm doing as the founder of Sonaar. We're a platform that matches skilled individuals to impact initiatives within represented and underserved communities. I think it was the 26th of February this year, so 2 days after the war kicked off in Ukraine. I got involved to help the migrant population, many of whom were students and skilled workers in Ukraine, help them evacuate safely into border countries. And there are quite a few interesting ways that we help them, and identity played a major role there.
To you, Nina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me to join you on this panel. My name is Nina Mohanty. I am the CEO and co-founder of a fintech company called Bloom Money. So what we do at Bloom Money is serve diaspora communities, give them the tools they need to build generational wealth. But that journey actually started off in 2020, before that even, with me trying to figure out, how people move, how money moves. My parents were both immigrants to the US. I'm an immigrant here, but I became very interested in forced migration in particular and started dedicating a lot of my time to that. So actually, initially in the research for what is now the company Bloom Money, I spoke to a lot of people who were asylum seekers or settled refugees to understand how they manage their money, if at all, and have lots of stories that I'm happy and eager to share with you all. But I also sit as an advisor for Talent Beyond Boundaries, which is a not-for-profit that works in bringing displaced people into skilled jobs around the world. And I kind of help them with the financial inclusion aspect. So very excited to join you all and share some insights today.
Cool. Louise?
Yes, hi everyone, and yeah, echoing everybody else, thank you so much for having me join this panel. It's incredibly timely, and I think it's one of the most fascinating use cases for identity and digital identity. So I'm really very glad that this group of people gets to talk about it. So I am the research lead for Women in Identity. I have been spearheading the work we've been doing on developing a code of conduct for the digital identity industry. So ensuring that all of the digital identity solutions that we're building work for everybody that they're intended to work for, rather than just a subsection of the people that they're intended to work for. The focus of that research up until this point has been on understanding the context in which digital identity sits. So we've been focused specifically on the human impact of ID exclusion. So what it actually means for individuals who are excluded and what it stops them from doing and how it stops them from participating in society at large. So that's the sort of the role in which I'm speaking on here, but in my spare time or my day job, I lead the data science and analytics function for GBG, which is an identity verification and fraud detection solution provider. So part of my time is spent making sure that these solutions work for everyone, and the other part of my time is actually spent helping to build those solutions as well. So hopefully those two things marry up quite nicely, and hopefully there's some useful insights that I can share as part of this conversation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Louise. Just noticing everyone here on this call has got more than one job. So, you know, super busy group of people. So delighted to have you with us, and thanks so much for giving us your time. I think my first question, I think just really, it will, I think, help understand and kind of frame the problem, because many people kind of watching this today may be sat in countries where, you know, there has been no conflict, and perhaps it's quite difficult to understand what that actually means on the ground. And so my first question is for you, Giselle. What are the major issues that you know you have seen on the ground? What's actually happening to the people, you know, in these conflicts when they're being displaced in places like the UK or, you know, Ukraine or others? And then I'm going to hand over to Nina to ask the same question to you as well, because I know that you're working with communities here in the UK. So first question for you, Giselle.
So yeah, I think the situation is it's evolved from when the war started to where we are now. It's been 3 months so far. In the earlier periods, the focus has been around emergency relief and providing emergency relief, i.e. getting people to safety as quickly as possible, getting them to the closest border, getting them to access to transportation and accommodation along the routes as well. So even while they were in Ukraine, getting them access to those services inside of Ukraine and getting them to the closest border, and then getting them across the border, and then getting them the services again once they've crossed over, and either repatriation services, so that help them connect them to their government, so that their governments could help them get back home for those that want to go back home, and for the ones that do not want to go, that would like to stay, then helping them with services that would help them settle or resettle. Now the focus is more on resettlement and integration. I think the key needs are still around safety and shelter. So accommodation is still very much on top of the list. We are very fortunate to have partnered with Airbnb for the issuance of vouchers for the migrant community. They did a fantastic job. I'm so grateful for them. So they provided access to, through us, we were able to give out thousands of accommodation vouchers for up to 2 weeks to 1 month, which was absolutely incredible, off Airbnb.org. We were also able to raise supplies from different diaspora communities in different parts of the world, and working with logistics company to have supplies come from the UK or from the Netherlands and get them redistributed to the major cities that we were seeing the migrant community go to, like Germany, to Berlin, and to Frankfurt, and also in Warsaw and Lublin, and in Budapest. There were quite a few of the migrant communities got settled. We also, right now, the needs are around immigration services. So the people that did not, that were not repatriated back home, either because it was not offered by their government or they cannot afford the flight back home themselves, and we're providing them, we're connecting them through international organizations and NGOs to services that can help them get access to immigration services and immigration lawyers so they know what their options are. As you guys may or may not know, although everyone that fled Ukraine are technically obliged to services, not everyone got access to it. So the long-term migrants that were living legally in Ukraine, that were working, that were doctors and that were engineers, because they did not have Ukrainian citizenship, then they were not provided access to even the accommodation within the EU or the transportation. There are situations where people were taken off the trains that were, although it was, trains that was meant to be for the people fleeing the war, and because they were not Ukrainian, they were taken off, and accommodation, they were also denied accommodation and access to shelters and things like that. So we are helping them in those scenarios, and healthcare, and access to, for many, I think it was something like 70 to 80% of the 80,000-ish migrants that were in Ukraine were actually students from countries like India and different African countries like Nigeria and Kenya and Ghana, and also a lot from South America as well, and different part of Southeast Asia. A lot of them, they were medical students. The majority of them are medical or engineering students. So from these countries, their parents had to sacrifice quite a lot to allow them to get access to education, international student fees. So going back home without a degree or without qualifications is actually, it's not, on one hand, we can say they can go back home, but on the other hand, going back home with half of your medical degree is not exactly the ideal scenario. So we had to focus on how can we get them perhaps re-enrolled into different universities across Europe. And then we came across the problems like the immigration policy may require you to have 10,000 euros in your bank account, or the cost of education may be dramatically higher than what the cost would have been in Ukraine, whereas it's affordable for us in the UK because we pay a lot more than other European countries. It's actually quite unaffordable for a lot of other countries. So we had to juggle all of these problems. These are the things that we're seeing. And on top of that, we're beginning to see, we were hearing whispers of human trafficking and all of these things we had to control and we had to monitor for as well.
Incredibly complex situation. Nina, I'm going to ask the same question to you. So, what kind of have you seen with the work that you're doing with people in the UK and in these sorts of environments and the problems that they have?
Yeah, I think what Giselle outlined for us is very apt, because I think oftentimes when we think of refugees or asylum seekers, there is a misconception that people choose to be a refugee. And this is something that really grinds my gears. One is not a refugee. It is a circumstance that one finds oneself in. And this is something that I often have to explain to people is, there's a really great quote. I think it's Dina Nayeri, who's the author of the book, The Ungrateful Refugee. And she says, you don't go running away from home unless home is like the mouth of a shark or something. I probably butchered the quote, but she's getting the point across that people do not leave unless the situation at home is untenable, right? So I think that's really important to highlight, because oftentimes people will go, oh, well, why don't they set these things up? And, why don't they bring their money across? Or why don't they bring all their comfortable things with them. And it's like, well, it's really hard to plan for that when you weren't planning for, you know, your apartment building to be bombed, right? So this is something to keep into consideration. When it comes to people that I've worked with in the UK, they're both asylum seekers who are currently a legal distinction as kind of pending a decision from the Home Office. And then you've got settled refugees who have been granted asylum and who have the legal right to remain in the UK. And it is pretty astonishing, you know, some of the facts that I came across while I was doing research. So during the pandemic, a single asylum seeker lives off about £37 a week. And they're given this on a card, and they have to subsist off that entirely for a full week. Oftentimes they're thinking about their family who they may have left behind, their spouse, their children, and they're thinking about how can we reunite with them as quickly as possible. They're thinking about the legal fees that they're going to incur. They're thinking about where am I going to live. There's a situation that many people find themselves in called the moving on period. So it's a 28-day period once asylum has been granted, where a settled refugee now has 28 days to move themselves from the accommodation that the government has put them in, basically register for a national insurance number, find a new place to live, put the down payment for that down. Like, it's just a mess. And that's actually where refugees are most at risk to become homeless. So there's lots of things at play here. And never mind the fact that whether highly skilled, as we call it, or not so highly skilled, people had lives that they left behind, right? So you've got people who owned businesses, people who owned bakeries, people who were engineers or doctors, and they come over and suddenly their skills are worthless. They don't have their community around them. They might not speak the language, and they're having to start all over. So it's like the worst holiday you could possibly imagine. I think people, you know, you see it in the press a lot where they say, oh, it's, you know, these people are coming across and it's like they're going on holiday. And it's like, no, this is a holiday from hell where nothing is going to go right. And you're just trying to start over again. So it sounds really, really bleak, but sadly, that is the state of affairs that I currently see within the UK.
Yes, super challenging. And, you know, you say it sounds really bleak. I think for many people it is, you know, can be really bleak. And what's the role of identity? Again, the question to you, back to you, Giselle. What's the role of identity within these situations?
Yeah, I think there are many potential ways that identity can be used. The way we used it, so when we established a relationship with Airbnb for vouchers, one of the things that we needed to do is to ensure that the people that got the vouchers were in need. They were the ones that were fleeing the war. Obviously, in times of war, you don't, as Nina rightfully said, you don't always remember to pack all the things that you need when you're running for your life. And we had to verify that the people that were requesting accommodation were people that were in need. So we partnered with a company in the UK to provide identity verification. It's a very well-known company, and we were so grateful. Actually, we got it because of when we reached out to you guys, Women in Identity, who were kindly able to introduce us, and that has helped dramatically ensure that the people are who they say they are. Especially with Airbnb's program, a lot of families were offering to host refugees in their house, and they wanted to know for sure that the people, you know, whereas you can't verify that someone is not, I don't know, a psychopath, you can verify that the person is who they say they are. And that was one role. When it came, we did some fundraising from the community. So when it came to distributing those funds, we wanted to make sure the funds were going to people that were known, and that were predominantly grassroots organizers that were known within the community. We asked them to verify their identity through that service. A lot of people did so, So we were able to pay the funds to those community members and have that assurance that the people that we're giving funding to are people that are who they say they are, once again, and not just a random person that's trying to profiteer from the problems around the crisis, the refugee crisis. Other access to immigration services, there were a lot of people that did not have their full passports, but they had some version of an ID on them. So let's say their driving license. The solutions that we use work with a lot of European countries' driving license as well. So if we're able to verify them the driving license, then essentially you verified the person, because that is a government issued identity product, and therefore it can be used in place of not having access to your passport or not having all the information that is required. As long as we're able to verify that that driving license is legitimate and that person is the person on the driving license, then we were able to provide them with services as well, and that was able to help in cases where they did not have access to their passport for immigration services, and tie that back to their embassies as well. The job market and education are some potential places that identity would be very helpful. As Nina mentioned, a lot of these people, or even a lot of people that are refugees, they had a previous life. Some of them were doctors, lawyers. They had transferable skills. But the absence of having that qualification or that certificate from the university, proof of that, then that could be it could be very difficult to find a job or to translate that into a new qualification where in your host country. And what we saw was we tried to verify the student's identity, the student ID from the university. And although it's not a formal identity document as issued by a government, if we're able to verify the student's ID, the student as students, although they didn't have their passports, because some of the students, it was the start of a term for many of the students. So there were a few international students that actually just starting their term in Ukraine. And that meant the administration's office had their passport when the war started. So where they were still applying for visas, for example. So using the student ID in the place of an official identity document, so that we can provide them with access to services, accommodation, and food, and some funding in some cases, were really, really helpful. And we couldn't do without identity solutions in those scenarios.
I mean, I don't know if you want to come in there and just add some some additional context from what you've seen, the work that you've been doing.
Sorry, did you say Nina or Louise?
Nina, you please, yeah.
Me, yeah. Yes, when we talk about identity, I think it makes me think of a lot of the work that I've been doing with Talent Beyond Boundaries, and actually even at Bloom to a certain extent. When I was pitching venture capitalists for our first round of funding, a lot of people loved the idea of financial inclusion, but they don't realize oftentimes that there are things beyond our control. For example, identity documents, where it's really difficult to bank an asylum seeker because they are not, a legal resident of the UK, and therefore don't have a biometric residency permit that, would normally be issued to a legal residing immigrant in the country. And so, I would have to say to them, yes, we are definitely working on financial inclusion, but we also have our hands tied behind our backs, because we can only do what is legal. We can, unless we get special permission from the Home Office, then there's not much we can do. And I used that in a conversation with Talent Beyond Boundaries, where they are on a special visa sponsorship program with the Home Office. It's a pilot where they are taking displaced people and bringing them across. And they're often, highly skilled nurses, doctors, and they've got jobs waiting for them. You know, they're going to work in the NHS, they're going to be part of our healthcare workforce, which is so necessary, and yet they can't open a bank account because they don't have the right documents. So this is something that was really difficult, where we bumped into it with so many high street banks. And in the end, you know, I went around probably bullying is not the right word, but pressuring a lot of the fintech companies out there to say, hey, you know, you say that you can run faster, you're stronger than all of the high street banks, prove it. And we finally kind of found workarounds where a lot of it was just human manual verification of documents instead of just using digital tools. But we did find workarounds like that, and it can be so difficult when, you know, you mentioned the statistic of lots of asylum seekers come from South Sudan, but South Sudan is going to have a lot of sanctions placed upon it, or Syria as a country. You know, anyone from Syria on a Syrian passport is going to probably get caught up in a bunch of PEPs and sanctions checks that you're running. And so we had to also, you know, figure out how to get through all of that. It was like those scenes in action movies with all the red lasers, and you're like, how do we get through this? But, you know, we got there in the end for most of them. And for some of them, sadly, there are still a few South Sudanese refugees that are trying to work for the NHS that still can't open a bank account. So lots more work to do.
Yeah, Louise, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think just from listening to both Giselle and Nina, the role of identity in all of this is it's completely foundational. So everything that you want to try and do is based off of or built on top of being able to prove that you are who you say you are. So whether it's, you know, immigration situations or dealing with the Home Office or embassies or governments, etc., you know, you need that proof, some kind of proof that you are you. And then building off of that, you want to access healthcare and education and financial services, all of that. Every single transaction that we go through in life is built off of that identity verification at its very base. So, you know, we've talked about some of the use cases. We could probably list all of the use cases, and they would all be dependent on us being able to verify who we are. Because when we can't, and I think, Giselle, you referenced this right up at the start, was as soon as you can't, that opens the doorway up to people wanting to take advantage of the situation. And sadly, as much as I would love humankind to be better than it is, you see that happening a lot. You saw it in the UK, people taking advantage of the COVID situation. I'm sure, Giselle, you can give us a fair few quite harrowing examples of people taking advantage of the situation in the Ukraine, because as soon as you lose that ID verification check or, you know, understanding, then you're opening up to, you know, nefarious actors taking advantage of a loophole in the system. So everything that we're trying to do is built off of that identity verification piece. And if we don't have that, we end up in the horrible converse situation of people just taking advantage of, you know, the awful things that are happening to certain subsets of people because the checks aren't in place and they feel they can just get away with these things. And we've had so many examples of that happening, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, you know, when I kind of, you know, having worked in the identity industry for a fair few years, you know, you kind of sit around these tables with people looking at use cases, and, you know, you hear people going, oh, well, you know, everyone's got a smartphone. Everyone's going to have a smartphone, or, you know, everyone's got a passport, or everyone's got a driving license. These kind of sweeping statements made often in these rooms, and not because, you know, anyone's a bad person, but just because they can't imagine what it's like to be in these situations, and actually some of the distress and some of the issues that are happening on the ground. And, you know, then potentially what we do is we end up with solutions not actually being built for the particular use case, because those use cases need to be built from the ground up. So, Giselle, I'm going to come back to you. Just what are the things that you see with some of those things on the ground, of the challenges that people have?
Yeah, it's actually, we faced loads of them. So obviously the first obvious one is that in times of crisis. Nobody planned. I mean, of course, it was brewing in the background for some time, but nobody planned for the war to actually kick off when it did. Nobody knew it was going to be kicked off. So when people were fleeing for their lives, they didn't always take their documents with them. Some because they didn't have access to the documents, as with the case of some of the students. There were also people that did take their document with them, and then it was kind of taken at the border, and then by some nefarious actors at the border for some of them. And then there were also scenarios where the documents that they had could not be read, because a lot of the solutions did not have the ability to read it, because maybe they came from a country that is not yet supported on the solutions. And then we had some other ones around. Some of the devices that they carried with them were obviously not so smart devices. Some of them, a lot of people do have smartphones, and we have great mobile penetration in the world and smartphone penetration. But then we fail to recognize that some of the devices are earlier version of smartphones that doesn't have the full functionality that we were used to in Europe. And this was especially the example for a lot of the students that were from developing parts of the world that were studying in Ukraine. They had a lot of devices that were just not compatible with solutions, and it wasn't just our solution, but other solutions. And we had to think about how we can get around these, because you can't just say computer says no and be like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't verify your identity, we can't help you. That is like that's the worst thing that you can do. You have to think about, if you don't have your passport, do you have a driving license? Has a driving license been issued in Europe? If it wasn't issued in Europe, is there another way that we can verify your identity? Show me your student ID, show me your this, show me your that. And there were a handful of people that were also refugees in Ukraine at the time of the war. And then we had to decide, like, how do we deal with those? Whereas technically, according to the European Union, they were meant to be provided solutions similar to those of the people that were legally refugees in Ukraine at the time of the war, should have been afforded the same treatment as those that were coming from Ukraine, but that was not what we were seeing. And then we have to decide, because a lot of these people, we cannot connect them to their embassies because they cannot, so we can't verify who they are that way. And then some of them don't have the documentation, or some of them, they're undocumented as well in Ukraine. So and that was just a handful, like less than 20. But we had to figure out, how do we help them? Because they are just as innocent as those Ukrainians that are fleeing the war. That is the difference. And sometimes you have to add that the human side. Like, on one hand, this process, and it's just like, show me your documents, like, I need to verify who you are before I can provide you with money. You tell me you need money, but I need to verify your identity. I can't just be handing out money. And then you have to kind of think of the human element. Okay, so we can't verify your identity using these methods, but how can we verify your identity using other methods when you don't have access to the best devices, and you may not have access to identity documents, and what we noticed as well is that because of these situations, there were quite a lot of profiteers, some consultants that were coming in and trying to get access to that data. Because I don't know if you know, but the data on minority communities are very valuable. It's very, very valuable on the market. And we had quite a lot of people that were promising help to the different refugees on the different migrant forums, saying that they can offer help, and they were sending forms, and they were collecting all of this data, some of them very sensitive data from the people. I had to do a bit of an education session with some of the grassroots leaders and say, no, you're not allowed to collect this sort of information. This is too sensitive. You cannot collect this information. Of course, in times of war, you can collect some of it, but you need to be able to secure it. And they had no idea, because they were people like you and I that just wanted to help. Their community was at risk. They just wanted to help. They wanted to help make things better for their community. And over time, what we saw is, because of this kind of form fatigue, we saw trust issues being developed, because people would say, yeah, but you said if I fill in this form, then you're going to provide me with accommodation. But I filled in 3 forms from 3 different people and nobody's provided me with accommodation. And then we had to go through the process and say, we need to verify who you are. And then there's a process as well to being able to get accommodation. We cannot just give you a voucher without knowing how many people you are, that you're verified, which country you're going to need accommodation in, because all of these are required attributes that need to be collected so that we can issue the voucher. And these were all of the problems that we were seeing, and the things that we needed to think about. There's that lack of trust, that people taking advantage and profiteering on the vulnerable communities, and not having the right documents, or not having the right tier documents, and not having the right devices, or the devices that support the solution. And yeah, there was a lot of manual workarounds. I didn't sleep well for, I think, 2 months. but in the end, it was all worth it. And I think it's definitely, it's really harrowing, but yeah, the role of identity in these processes, you cannot underestimate it.
Yeah, I think kind of what I'm really hearing you say is, you've just got to be super pragmatic.
Mm-hmm.
Hugely vulnerable kind of, people in this situation. But you can't, you said, you had like 20 people that you couldn't verify. Well, those are 20 people in need, aren't they? That's actually a lot of people, isn't it? When they're there and you're trying to help them. An incredibly vulnerable situation, and you've got to be really pragmatic and kind of work through those things, rather than saying, well, we haven't been able to verify you using this single method, therefore you can we're not going to be able to help you. Louise, I don't know if you want to add, because I know you've been working for Women in Identity, doing a lot of research into how we as an identity community can kind of think about building better solutions. What are some of the things that you think people need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think it builds nicely on what Giselle just said, because I think if I look at the research that we published at the start of the year, which was about that human impact, the key finding for me across both of the markets that we looked at, which was the UK and Ghana, was the inflexibility of the processes that exist. So it's like, okay, you need driver's license, passport, something government issued, and then it's a flow diagram from that point. And really, if you fall out of that sort of path that they've designed for, then your options are very, very limited. Historically, that's been the case. And I think even to this day, still the case in a lot of places. So it's the people who have designed the systems, and I think you said this before, Emma, with no ill intent at all. They've designed a system that they're like, right, yeah, okay, I can see how this works. I can see how this will work for me, for my family, for my friends, etc. So therefore, it's going to work for pretty much everybody. And then that's the process that's in place. And then as soon as you fall out of that chain, so you don't have a breeder document like an ID, a birth certificate or a passport, driver's license for whatever reason, then it's like, oh, well, sorry, we can't help you. Go away, come back when you've got the relevant documentation that you need. And I think in the instance you're talking about, Giselle, you can't send people away, because this is kind of a life and death situation. Fine if you can't open a bank account at a high street brand in a branch or whatever, go away and come back. That is a situation when it's not ideal for you to go away and come back. It's very inconvenient, but it's not a life or death situation. Whereas what Giselle's just been talking about is you're fleeing from a war zone, which is literally life and death. So you can't just turn around and say, sorry, we can't verify you, so next in line. It's just that level of inflexibility just doesn't work, and it further excludes so many different people. And I think another thing that we saw, or one of the findings I think from the research, and again, speaks back to what Giselle is saying, is that there needs to be alternative methods. So if you can't go down the immediate path that's been designed for, okay, we'll default to the second one. That doesn't work to the third one. That doesn't work to the fourth one. So there needs to be as many different options for all of the different sort of eventualities that you might have to face. And all of those options need to have parity. So it can't just be the case of, oh, well, you people over here with your passport driver's license, you're the gold standard. Everybody else is just kind of lesser than you. And, you know, we don't really treat those alternative journeys as equal to the one that we've designed for. So I think it's about having those alternatives that are born out of pragmatism in some situations, but are also born out of empathy in, you know, in times of non-crisis. You know, let's think beyond just the situations that you and I and us on this call go through, and let's think about who else might have to go through this journey and what other obstacles, barriers, or challenges those people might face. Because I think with identity, digital identity, or identity in all of its forms, there can be no such thing as an edge case, because everybody needs to access these services. Literally everybody has the right to access these services as well. So it can't just be that, oh, well, you know, I'm designing for Louise, who has the latest smartphone and has all of the devices that she needs. And if I can get people like Louise through, great, doesn't matter about anybody else. But when it comes to identity and accessing government services, then everybody has the right to access those. And therefore you can't say, oh, we're designing for the 80% and the 20% someone else's problem. There isn't allowed to be, or at least there shouldn't allowed to be, edge cases in this situation, because every case is equal and valid and deserves right to, you know, access to all of the services that they should have.
And so what happens when we you know, when we don't, things don't get deployed correctly? You know, often people talk about, and I'm going to come back to you, Giselle, often people talk about use of biometrics. And, you know, people going, well, you know, that's okay. You know, we'll do something, some kind of magic with a biometric. You know, what happens when we don't do things correctly?
So, so I have seen a few of these. I mean, if we don't deploy, if we're too rigid in our approach to verifying identity, then obviously we leave out those that are in need, and these edge cases creep in. And what I find is that when you don't design your processes properly or you don't include enough use cases, then the people that suffer, they suffer a lot. They might be smaller in number, but like facing complete exclusion for things that they can't control often. It's unfair. And I know it's unfair to say, like, you know, it's simplistic to say it's unfair, but it is. In the time of war, when everyone is trying to preserve their life, to find that someone do not have their identity document and you don't have a process in place in providing services to them, in this day and age when we have so many options and so many technologies and so many ways that people interact with the digital world, I think it's a bit lazy. And to be honest, like when I was doing everything that I was doing with the migrants that were fleeing the war in Ukraine, I knew that some of it is not official identity verification. The only thing that is considered proper identity verification is government issued documents. But then I knew that a lot of the students, because we came to very quickly, when I said, okay, so you need some money, how much do you need? Can you just verify your identity using this solution? And they're like, oh, miss, my passport is with the school. And I said, okay. So at first it was just like, how come your passport is with the school? And then I learned about the use case where I learned that they just started that term. They just came to Ukraine that term and they started, and their passport was still with the administration offices. And that I said, okay, so can you prove that you were a student at that university? And they said, yes, I have my student ID. And then we had to work backwards from there to try to find a list of student IDs from the university to verify. And then we had students that were in different key areas like Krakow and Sumy So these are the areas that were heavily shelled, and they were not able to leave for a long time. They were just shelled continuously by the Russians, and they were not able to leave. So we had to figure out, okay, so because of that, where are you right now? And then we had to go on a kind of crowd verification as well. Like, okay, so if you don't have your student ID, is your name on the student list? And then can everyone around you verify who you are? Because they're all together. A lot of the students were all together as students in like the same bunkers. So I said, okay, I went through and I asked, like, there were student leaders we kind of elected student leaders. It's like, you're a student leader, everybody gets to be a student leader. You're in charge of this group, and you need to be able to, we will use you as a contact for any needs within this group for the people that do not have everything that they should have, because you've been going to school with them for the last how long. And we had to create all of these informal processes that were, in my opinion, very commonsensical, but it was not the official processes, because the reality is, if we followed just the official processes, a lot of these students, a lot of people may have been left behind, right? So yeah, if we don't deploy it the processes or the solutions correctly, then just a lot of people get left behind, and it's not through no fault of their own. And as simplistic as it sounds, it is unfair. They were just as innocent, as I said before, in the war as the Ukrainians, and therefore they should not be, held back because of, the situations that they found themselves in.
Yeah. And Nina, do you want to add to that? What happens if we don't deploy these things correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's two things at play. There's what happens afterwards, and what happens before. So afterwards, I mean things like, once we have very sensitive identity documents or biometrics, where is that information stored? Who is the keeper of this information? What is done with that information? So I think we've talked about in the past, on the US border, that there are some kind of facial recognition businesses that are now handing over that data to various US government entities that may not be using them for reasons that are, consensual for sure, but that person might not want to have their face used for, right? One of the things that shocked me when I first started working with a lot of asylum seekers is their request to remain completely anonymous. Less so now for kind of perhaps the Ukrainian refugees that are very much the center of the news agenda currently, but especially in Latin America, from countries like Eritrea, Ethiopia, Palestine, where you have people who might have been political dissidents in certain cases, or in Latin America, fleeing from gang violence. They're terrified that someone is going to hunt them down and find them. So if you do not have, custody over this information and it gets out somewhere, who is going to find it, and what might that person do once they have that information? So we have to be very, 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 very careful and protective of the data that we do collect. And then the before bit that I want to return to is deploying things properly means building products that work for everyone. And Giselle has talked about, these edge cases, but one bit that's not an edge case is brown and black people. So just simply put, the number of times that I've had to re-upload a document or retake a photo, redo a video, simply because my skin color is not being picked up by some software is insane. And I know that it has become an issue for a lot of other people that I've worked with, to the point where, like, actually, if I can upload a black and white document, that actually often works better than actually having the color of my face. So there's things like that where, there are huge swaths of people who have brown and black faces, beautiful brown and black faces, but struggle to have these solutions work for them simply because they were not built for them. So this is something else that I'm very I can feel my blood boiling. I'm like, oh, so upset about this. But two bits that I think we should be mindful of when deploying solutions.
Yeah, for sure. And Louise, have you got a couple of points you want to make on that?
Sure. I mean, having been one of those people whose often face is not recognized by facial recognition technology in airports, I know the pain of that. But I suppose as a technologist, you kind of think, oh, well, you know, biometrics, everybody has them, very hard to fake or forge. That's the answer. That's great. And that's what we oftentimes lean into, the technological solution, because it's there and because we can. But then you think about that, and obviously you have the issues, particularly with facial recognition, of it not necessarily recognizing some people at all many times over. And then they just have to default to going and seeing the guy at the desk to say, yes, you are you, please. So there's all sorts of issues with leaning into the technology because it isn't often designed with everybody in mind. It's often not tested with everybody in mind either. It's tested on a certain subset of faces that might be quite homogeneous and therefore doesn't work for anybody that doesn't fit into that test data set, or at least doesn't work as well. And then so that there is that. And then there's the data security elements of it as well. So things like, you know, the risk of biometrics data being compromised is so much greater. I mean, it's awful having any kind of data compromised, passwords, etc. But passwords can be changed. Irises, you know, fingerprints, all of those things, not changeable. So if that data does fall into the wrong hands, you know, that's out there forever, and you are going to have to live with the repercussions of that forever, because you can't change that data. So obviously all the, you know, great care is taken with all types of data, but when it comes to biometrics, it's even more, it has to be thought of even more deeply, because if that data gets compromised, then there's no way of uncompromising it. And I think lots of people have rushed into the biometric solution because it is entirely unique to each individual, but haven't necessarily reconciled the amount of heightened security that has to go around that technology, that data in particular, because like I said, if that gets compromised, there's no way back from it. So I think we rush into these technological solutions because we think, oh, well, there's some things in the pros list. We don't tend to analyze the cons list as well. And therefore, I think we often end up with suboptimal solutions that actually carry much greater risks than we ever intended to put out there into the world.
And I think just to build on that before we move on, I think this is something that we saw, right? There were all of these people that were, because once again, of course, your biometrics is unique to you. So it's a perfect way to identify someone. But a lot of these grassroots organizers were not trained to, even like your passport details. A lot of the grassroots organizers, they had good intentions to verify people's identity. However, they were not trained on how to hold sensitive data and how to keep sensitive data or really PID, personally identifiable data. So that was like a big thing. I went into a group, I had a spreadsheet that had thousands of people's passports. I was just like, are you kidding me? It's like, no, you're not allowed to take any of this information. It was just stored. The worst part of it is that it was sent from one group. It was easily sent to me without proving anything about myself. And I had to tell them about this. So that's when I created like this note, like, guys, all data is not data. That you know my name, you do not know my surname. You could probably find out my birthday, but you know, all of these information is not information. You cannot give people's passport details, and you know, and there were these other profiteers, these other consulting companies that were going in there trying to collect people's iris scans and fingerprints, and you know, all for the sake of helping with accommodation and funding. And what they were doing was just building up data so that they can sell and use these data in the future for projects that a lot of these people were not, they did not know. They were in an emergency situation. They just wanted access to services, and they were essentially taken advantage of. And once I saw this, I flagged it because it was really quick. It's just like, So what accommodation? What is the promise here? How much money? I want to know, like, you're telling me that you're going to provide all of this for my community. So tell me, how much are you providing? When you're going to provide it? For all the people that you've collected information for, what have you actually done? And that's how I flagged a lot of them. And there were loads of them that were coming through. And an additional point is sometimes it's not just not being able to identify Black and brown faces, but having shortcut solutions, like maybe reducing the fault threshold for Black and brown faces, and therefore identifying false positives. So therefore you could be going through security, and because they didn't do the full fault threshold on your face, so your facial scan, you end up being equal to someone that looks nothing like you through algorithms, and then you get pulled aside, and then you're like, no, well, look at this person, it looks nothing like me. So that is also a problem, right? We have to design these solutions in a way that actually is fit for purpose, and they have to include everyone, because the reality is Black and brown faces, there are billions of us, and it is a good enough economic use case to include us in your algorithms and to design for us as well.
Yeah, for sure. And so just to sort of close, I'd be really interested in, getting people's perspective on what happens if we do it right. So Giselle, back to you on that first question then.
So I think if we do it right, then it's all about, it works, right? If we do it right, then we have less people are left behind. It just works. More people are included. All the people that created the solution for profit, they get more money. Everybody gets access to the services they need. It's not about, nobody gets left behind. And these are all, very simplistic, ideological ways of thinking about it. But the reality is, like, when processes are implemented well, they are invisible, and we don't have these. We're not going to face these problems. And there are so many different ways to tackle identity. Identity isn't just doesn't have to be just government issued. It could be crowdsourced. It could be using a lot of attributes that are publicly available online. There's no, unfortunately, the way that it is done by law is government issued identifiers or verified attributes. But there are so many different ways of tackling or creating an identity. And I think if we were to explore some more of these different ways, then we can come up with really, really incredible solutions that would incorporate a lot of the use cases that we see as edge cases that would enable us to provide more services and solutions to those people.
Louise, do you want to, what happens if we do it right?
Yeah, I mean, Giselle, you're right. I mean, people get included and everything just works, and we don't have to have, as much as fun as this conversation is, we don't have to have conversations like this anymore, because it just works. And there is no reason for, you have to be pragmatic and have to come up with workarounds, because it's something we don't even think about anymore, because it's just seamless. But I think, again, picking up on Giselle's point at the end, you're right that the way things work right now, it's very government issued oriented. And I think there are starting to be movements towards making identity user controlled, so individually controlled. And I don't think that's the be all and end all solution. I think there are plenty of risks associated with that. But I think the intent behind it is right, because identity is, my identity is not my passport. It's not my driver's license. I don't have a driver's license, but it wouldn't be if I had one. Those are just like means of proving that I'm Louise and I'm this and that and the other. That's it. Identity is such a multifaceted thing. And I think we need to make it more of a multifaceted thing for the different use cases that we as individuals have to sort of like go through and serve. And I think as solution providers, we also need to be thinking about that as well. So from an identity verification standpoint, yes, we need to not just have the government ID means and all that. We need to have alternatives. They need to have parity, etc. But I think putting the user in greater control of what their identity is and means and how they prove it and how they share information with other organizations, I think is probably the way we're going to move forward, and I think the way that we should move forward ultimately.
Nina.
I mean, I echo everything that Louise and Giselle have said. I think the last thing I'll leave you with, sitting from where I do as a fintech founder, in the tech world, I think in product, I often think about how can we solve for the most vulnerable customer. If we solve for the most vulnerable person, then everyone else benefits. And so, you know, say we figure out how to solve for someone who has not carried their passport with them across a border in a war zone, and we solve for that to be done well, maybe that means that it benefits you when you're on holiday in Mykonos and your passport gets stolen. And so you can still verify your identity in, you know, a safe and secure way. So there are benefits for us all. And it really makes me excited to know that so many people are thinking about it. And I hope that this conversation has got people thinking about it in a different way.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I'm just, I loved what you said there last, just because it's one of the things that I talk about is if we solve for the 20%, which, you know, the 80% are going to benefit, you know, the 80%, they're going to be able to have their identities verified. You know, and I think it's thinking about, you know, they're not edge cases. These are real use cases. And we have to be super pragmatic, but we also have to put the user at the center of the things that we're designing, because these are systems and processes for humans. And if we don't put them at the center, and if we think that everybody just looks like the people that are sat around the table at that point in time, we're going to miss. You know, we're not going to have solutions that are designed for people. And you know, in the worst case scenario, when we talk about people who are fleeing war, that can mean that, you know, it's the difference between, you know, kind of life and death, and they have no other choices. And if we can't verify their identities and we can't get them access to things, then that's a real challenge. And it's something that many people, I think, probably watching this are going to have so much more empathy for, just listening to all of you talk about those use cases. And thank you so much for coming on. If anybody wants to join Women in Identity, you can do so. It is free of charge to join, and just go to www.womeninidentity.org. I want to thank Nina, Louise and Giselle for coming on today. Thank you so much for your time, and be delighted to, I'm hoping everyone can listen to this again.